Hi, my name is Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and welcome to Wetpixel Live. And I'd like to welcome Alexey Alexeyevich, my Russian comrade from Peterborough, actually, to this episode.
Send Peterborough, please.
Yes, send Peterborough. And today we're going to talk about something that's a bit of a difficult issue, a thorny issue, and that is housing floods and what to do if your housing floods, and how to, or to some extent, how to avoid getting housing floods. I think this is more about talking about what to do if your housing floods. So I thought passively I'd introduce it by saying I've had one catastrophic housing flood, and it was caused by a guy in the boat handing me the camera. And he was holding the macro port, the long macro port on it. It twisted, and literally put it in the water, glug for the water. That was the end of the camera. How about you, Alex? How many floods have you had?
Well, I've had water in my housing more times than I know.
Yeah.
But in terms of ever losing a camera, I've never ever had a flood that stopped me shooting on any house camera. The only flood I've had that killed a camera was within a Konos 5.
Yeah.
They do say in underwater photography there are two types of underwater photographers. Those that have had a flood and those that are going to have one.
Yeah,
so
it's
something that we all have to face up with too.
Yeah.
And I do like the fact that we use the word flood because it kind of implies this biblical catastrophe, which I think it sums up exactly how everyone feels.
Yeah.
It really does. It is the worst feeling in the world. So if you are on a trip and someone has a flood, just put yourself in their position and think how they're going to be feeling, because no one's happy about it afterwards. So just bear that in mind. So I would say in terms of dealing with them, I think the first thing to talk about is a catastrophic camera killing flood. Typically, is always going to happen at the beginning of a dive. Yep. Housings typically don't suddenly start leaking catastrophically halfway through the dive.
Yeah, unless
there are exceptions.
Yeah, unless something gets broken, but it's very rare. Yeah.
It's usually something hasn't been put together right, or something becomes not put together right in the process of getting in the water.
Yeah.
As Adam said, it's a boat crew passing it down, twists something, or the movement on the boat makes something loose and no one realizes when it's handed in the water.
Yeah.
So the first advice in terms of dealing with a flood is always pay proper attention to your housing when it's first handed to you.
Yeah.
So give yourself a second or two to get comfortable in the water before having it passed down to you.
Yep.
Or if you're jumping with your housing, make sure you give the camera some attention before you descend.
Yep.
It's not, if it's, as long as it's in the water, it's going to flood. So what I, do is I'll turn the camera towards me, so the main window into the housing is visible to me, and I'll just point the camera up at the surface, and I'll just that way, if any water comes in, it's going to end up in the port.
Yep.
And if it was flooding catastrophically, I would see so.
Yep.
Thankfully, I've not seen that, but on the occasions where I have had things go wrong, it's that point there that's enabled me to come straight out the water, and the camera's had half a mug of water in there, and it's been in there for a few seconds, and it's no problem at all.
Yep.
So that is the best advice for dealing with a flood is always make that check at the beginning of the dive. Once you're down there, it's unlikely to flood catastrophically. So the other type, sorry, Adam, you're going to ask.
Well, I think the other thing to mention is that the survival thing. First of all, check it when you get in the water. But the other survival thing is point the port down, because by pointing the port down, whatever water, if there is water inside it, it gathers in an area of the housing where there normally isn't a great deal that it can damage.
Absolutely.
If it was to get at the lens, you would probably have access to other lenses. Obviously, once it's in the back of the housing, you've got all the housing electronics and the camera electronics, and that's probably going to be terminal. So point the port down.
Absolutely. And that's what I was going to come to, is that the other time you might get a flood is if you've got a hair on the O-ring, some grit in the O-ring, something like that, which is going to cause a slow seeping of water through the dive.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of flood that will set your leak alarm off during the dive, something like that. And when that red light or that siren flashes or honks underwater, it does get your attention as a photographer.
Certainly does.
And that's caused by that. The first thing you should do then is, again, tip the camera nose down in the water.
Yep.
This does two things. One, as Adam was just explaining, it takes the water away from the camera body and the lens to some degree, particularly the dome port, and means that there's a very good chance of the camera surviving this.
Yep.
It also, though, importantly, allows you to see how much water you're dealing with.
Yeah.
If your leak alarm is going off and you turn the camera so the port is down in the water and no water is collecting in there, chances are your leak alarm is going off because the battery is low, there's some humidity on the sensors, a tiny drop of water from you opening the back O-ring has set the alarm off. And if you're able to, you might at that point decide, I'm going to continue the dive for 5-10 minutes and check it again. Because it's clearly not filling up with water at any rate of knots. And this is specifically if it starts doing this midway through a dive, not, you know, you haven't just got in the water. It's clearly been fine for 20 minutes and suddenly it's doing this. I have to say, personally, I find it very hard to carry on shooting at that point because just the distraction of this thing, I'm never going to take a great photo.
You can't focus, can you?
It was a once-in-a-lifetime situation, I might carry on shooting. But I have to say, every time mine goes off, I come up to the surface, I'd rather sort it out and do a second shorter dive on the tank than anything else. But that's...
I think the moisture alarms, the moisture detectors, I mean, often now they're integrated into vacuum circuitry as well. Excuse me. But they are very, very sensitive, and the slightest trace of moisture. So Alex mentioned things like, you know, a bit of condensation. So, you know, you're going from a warm environment into a cold environment. The condensation will tend to trickle to the bottom of the housing, and that can set things off. Obviously, that's not going to do any damage to your camera's weather sealing. Will deal with that. So it's, you know. The leak alarm going off is not a definitive, I need to rush to the surface and get my camera sorted out. Having said that, as Alex said, the distraction of the leak alarm means that I can't focus on anything else.
And then you might as well be out the water, sorting it out and getting ready to dive again. So if you turn that housing dome down or port down and there is water, that's the time you want to go up. Now, if you've been in the water for 20 minutes and the leak alarm has just started going off, you don't need to race to the water at a death-defying rate. You know, you can make a slow, steady ascent, keeping the camera, and this is the really important part, in that port down situation. So any further leakage is just collecting in the port. You may still choose to do a safety stop. And obviously, if you need to do more than a safety stop, you should do it. No camera's worth any of those problems. You know, remember, it is only a camera, even if it's expensive. But, you know, you know, you should have time to do that. If it's been leaking slowly, it's unlikely to start leaking faster. So, you know, you've got some time to make a slow, steady ascent and get up. As long as you keep the camera like that. If you're constantly tipping the camera around like this, you're going to wash the camera with water. Then, when you get to the surface, there's a couple of things to do. First of all, what I would do then is I would tilt my, well, when I was coming up, I'd pull my strobes down. So they're down like this, and then I'll get to the surface, inflate my BC, and either balance my camera on top of my head. I nearly always dive in a hood because I haven't got any hair. And so the softness of the hood, you can just balance the camera on top of your head, and that keeps the camera nice and out of the water. But don't try and have all of the system out of the water. Get the strobes back down in the water so you're not lifting up too much weight. And that way you can wait for a boat pickup without the camera being in the water and continue getting water, and you're controlling it that way. Or alternatively, if you're more comfortable, maybe inflate your BCD, float on your back, and balance it on your
chest.
And that way you're keeping the camera out of the water until you can get picked up. If you need to make like a long swim back to shore, then, you know, you're better on the chest and just slowly kicking yourself back in on your back. But keeping the water off the camera when you're out, when you've got to the surface, is as important as keeping the water off the camera when you're underwater. Don't get to the surface and then just forget about it.
We're in there now.
You know, as long as you keep the water away from the camera's going to be fine. So make that a priority. As soon as you can get out the water, then, if there's another photographer on the boat to help you, get them to help you if they're dry. So get the housing open, get the camera out of the housing, and get the battery and memory card out of the camera. The battery in the camera, if there is water in the system, can make it cause a lot of issues. And you want to get the memory card out so that any pictures you had on there are safe.
So one of the things,
taking your award-winning picture on that dive.
One of the things that I was going to mention was that in general, when I realise that I've got a flood that's serious, I'm going to flick the camera off. Switch the power off. I mean, it doesn't shut all the circuitry down, but you're making, what you don't want is, you don't want a situation where you've got salt water or whatever inside the housing with the power running. So once you realise that for you the dive is over, just switch it off. You know, it's not doing any good anyway. You're going up. So, and then as Alex says, once you get to the surface, the next phase on from that is to pull the camera's battery out along with memory cards. If you can get it easily, most cameras have a separate coin battery in them as well. if you can get at that and get that out as well, get that out to kill the power to it, basically. Because the less power you have going around electrical circuits that are wet, the better. Yeah.
Now, if the camera has got completely soaked in fresh water, this is where it becomes a little bit harder. If the camera is clearly completely drenched in salt water, that's the point where you may want to put the whole camera in fresh water. But if your camera is full up and you take the lens off and there's water between the lens and the sensor, chances of that camera surviving are almost zero.
Yeah.
At that point, you might as well get it into fresh water, see what can be saved.
Yeah.
But chances are that camera is toast.
Yeah.
If the camera's just wet on the outside, which is what I see in 90% of the floods, chances are you don't need to wash it in fresh water, because actually the camera is predominantly dry.
Yeah.
So don't think, oh, it's had a flood in salt water, I need to wash it under a tap. Because actually the camera may have only had a small amount of water on the outside. They're pretty well weather sealed these days.
Yeah, they are.
And then you're better off to get a damp cloth or some tissue paper with some fresh water on it and wipe the outside of the camera down once you've got the battery and everything out. I usually will take the lens cap off as well, just because I want to check if there's water inside. So if there's no water in the battery compartment, no water behind the lens, chances are you've got away with it. And then it's a case of then you need to assess when you think the camera's dried out. So gear that's had a real soaking, you then want to do what you can to really dry it out as well as you can. And that's when submerging it in a bag of rice.
Rice, yeah, it's really good.
It's really easy to get hold of on liverboards. If you've got silica gels, you can put it in a sealed Ziploc with silica gels as well. That obviously they're more effective than rice. Or if you haven't got any of that to hand, getting it somewhere dry, airy, and warm is going to help drive water out.
And I mean, again, hair dryers, if you have a hair dryer, be careful with them because some of them are pretty hot. But again, blowing warm air at it will help. It's not.
But don't use the really powerful blows.
Yeah,
same with if you've got access to a compressed air in a cylinder. You don't want to blow water deeper into the system. But all those things can help in an emergency. And then the inside of the housing, that is something that you can probably, if it's got a real soaking, get the water out of it. If it's a mild soaking, think about the damp cloth. If it's had a heavy soaking, you might want to wash it with fresh water, particularly if there's large sections of it that haven't got electronics on them. But if it's had a real soaking, you're better off getting all that salt water off it as quickly as possible. And a lot of that housing circuitry can be replaced after a trip. And a freshwater wash might keep it working for the trip.
The housing circuitry as well, if you have it, using contact cleaner is a really, really good way of cleaning it up. You can't really use it on a camera because the circuit boards themselves, but generally, a really good dose of contact cleaner. All the contact cleaner is basically just sprays on, evaporates off, and hopefully takes any moisture and any gunk that's a third degree, for example, that's good because of the soaking. So I would tend to, if I have it, I would tend to give it a really good spray with some contact cleaner once the obvious moisture is removed. So obviously,
and with a lot of housings, actually, a lot of these circuit boards are just held in by a screw or a pair of screws, and it's actually relatively easy to unscrew those, whip them out, and then you can deal with the housing and the electronics separately. The ports, you can wash them inside and out, and get all those cleaned up and get things drying. Break the kit down. Lay it out, particularly in the sun. You don't want to, you don't want to leave it out for days in the sun. But when it's been covered in salt water, you want to get it dry and get it dry in all the places. Another thing I would do is, particularly when the housing's in bits, is shake bits of it to get water out. Not trying to break it, but shake it to loosen the water and allow that to come out. And then I think you then got this. You're trying to do two things. You're first of all trying to keep yourself shooting in the field, which requires one set of circumstances, and then you're worried about the long-term prospects of the housing. If it's a bad flood long-term, it's likely going to be all resurfaced anyway, and probably going to have a lot of new parts added to the housing. So short-term, you just really want to try and keep the system working in the field. And that's when, that's when maybe a strong freshwater rinse might keep it working for a few days, but long-term, probably a lot of the circuitry is going to end up rusting and corroding away. And then, so you might be willing to do those things to keep it working on that trip, knowing that it's going to be booked in and have a major overhaul after the trip. But and I think the other thing I'd say, and said it with the dome port scratching chat we had as well, is get help. When it's your gear, you won't make good decisions. You'll be stressed, you'll be nervous, worried. When it's someone else's gear or someone else is helping you, they'll make much better decisions. And generally, they'll be much more helpful to sort you out than you will be yourself. So get help. Don't be afraid to ask for help, because actually that cool head of someone who's not emotionally involved will make much better decisions than you are.
Yeah. I think the other thing to mention is with housing, well, with floods, it's always nice if you know why the housing has flooded. I remember one of our workshops a few years ago, we had someone with a housing that we couldn't figure out. It kept flooding, and we couldn't figure out why until eventually we found a hairline crack in one of the lens ports. It was a brand new housing, whether it happened on the way to Lembe or whatever. No, it was cracking, and but it was very, very difficult to spot. So once you've calm down, then spend some time trying to figure out whatever's happened. Sometimes it's obvious, and you go, okay, well that happened, but a lot of the time it's more subtle, and you need to be actually kind of trying to figure out why, because it's very hard to have confidence in housing unless you pin down what's happened and can prevent it in the future. So yeah,
and I think the best thing that you can do as well is obviously the next dive the housing empty.
Yeah.
Do a full dive, pressing all the buttons, using the housing. Yeah. Take a piece of lead, wrap it in a t-shirt, wrap it in some bubble wrap inside the housing, so the housing's nice in the water. Yeah. Make sure the housing is bone dry inside beforehand, so that if you do get water inside, you know it's new water, not old water.
Yeah.
And that's when it's good to do that little bit of shaking, making sure that there's no water hidden in any crevices.
Rattle it loose,
that then makes you think your leak's carrying on when actually it was water that was already in there.
Yeah.
And then you'll get your confidence back. You'll know the housing's working. And then you can hopefully get back to shooting.
Yep. That's all great advice, Alex. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Adam. One more thing. If you have got gear that's died because of saltwater flooding, put it in the rice bag for 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever. But then put the batteries back in and check it's working. Yes. It may not be working, but if it doesn't work, don't throw it in the skip straight away. Put it back in the rice, give it another 24 hours, and keep checking it. I have seen, particularly with strobes, them magically come back to life after floods like this. Yeah. Just, we were all like, yeah, it's toast, it's gone. We should throw it in the trash, take it underwater, play with it, whatever. Yeah. And then actually a couple of days later, suddenly it was working again. Yeah,
there's nothing to be lost by giving it more time to dry out, is there? So
yeah. So, electronics does some weird things when it's got salt water.
Yeah, it does. Normally it's a short-term fix, but yes, that's a very good point. So don't be too hasty to condemn it. Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. Alex hasn't got any pictures of any flooded housings on his website, so we're not going to suggest you go and see him, but he has lots of wonderful pictures. So please go to alexamustard.com and have a look.
Or Alex Mustard 1 on Instagram as well is a great place to follow me.
Great. Okay. And I would like to thank very much Icolite Underwater Systems for sponsoring this episode. I'd like to thank you all very much for watching as well. Please give us a like if you enjoyed it or you got some value from the episode. And it's obviously great if we can simulate some kind of debate by you asking questions in the comment section below. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all again soon.